Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. I'm so excited to talk to Mira today, an inspirational woman dealing with the loss and trauma of her partner. I found her through Instagram, where she shares authentically about her journey through her voice that connects with many other grievers, not just young widows. She shares about Brian's death, which came very quickly, within 7 weeks of his second diagnosis, and how she finds her way back to living life as a young widow. Mira and I speak a common language and share the purpose of teaching people to become grief literate and the importance of working with a trauma-informed lens, which for both of us is the basis of dealing with grief and trauma.
I think the most important step is just really listening to what feels right for you and being in tune and remembering that there's time. Like, it doesn't all need to happen immediately. And maybe for some people, for the first year, it is all just distraction and traveling and little pockets here and there where they're really processing in moments that they can. But it's just, we're all so different, and there's so much pressure that we put on ourselves to do it right or to get to a certain place in our grief or to heal within a certain timeline. And it's just so unique for everybody. So I think that would be my main piece of advice.
About this week's guest, Mira Simone is a widow, mother, published writer, grief coach, and grief literacy advocate. She is also a registered mental health occupational therapist in Ontario, Canada. In early 2019, Mira's life was blown apart when her partner Brian was diagnosed with an unbelievably aggressive cancer. He died 7 weeks later, leaving her alone with their almost 3-year-old daughter. Prior to Brian's death, she worked in a mental health space. But it wasn't until his death that Mira began to explore the grieving process. In 2022, she launched Moon Mira, her grief coaching business, through which she supports widows and grievers in more intimate group containers and provides grief literacy training for grief support people and healthcare professionals. She's currently in the early stages of writing a memoir, with support from the Canada Council for the Arts. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. So welcome, Mira. It's so nice to have you on the podcast. Thank you for taking your time. How are you today?
I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm having a really wonderful day. I'm at my cottage and I'm looking out at this beautiful forest that's just about to bloom. And the time of year it is here in Canada, it's like there's nothing blooming yet, but you can just feel that it's all right under the surface and it's just about to all come out of the earth. So I'm really feeling that energy today.
Beautiful. I think that's a beautiful topic or beautiful way into our podcast in terms of let's see what's coming up. Let's see what's blooming in this. And just for the listener, I found Mira on Instagram. And as you, as the listener, know, I choose my guest. Some of them come to me and they want to be my guest, but some I choose, and I choose them because I like the way they're sharing, what they're sharing, and their presence. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation because I feel that me and Mira, we have a common language. We're both very grief literate and trauma informed. And once you go and look at her Instagram, you will know and understand what I mean. But why don't we start with you telling the listeners a little bit about your story of loss and trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So, normally when I tell my story of loss and trauma, I start by talking about the cancer diagnosis and death of my husband, Brian. But we were just chatting a little bit before we began, and I was encouraged to go back even further. And I think that's such a beautiful invitation because often when we do go through a really significant loss or trauma, like I did with the death of my husband, it re-triggers things from our past that we might not have even ever identified as being traumatic. And then we start to realize that they did have elements of trauma. And that is the case for me. And I don't normally speak about this very much, but when I was 10, my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And so he was quite young to be diagnosed with that disease. It's usually, diagnosed later in life. And as a child, my family, we navigated that diagnosis throughout my entire childhood, throughout all of my teenage years, and on and on and on. And I think there's a lot about my husband's death that re-triggered a lot of that from earlier, even though it was a very different type of grief. It was much more of an anticipatory grief because my dad was still with us. He lived longer than Brian. He passed away in 2021, but Brian passed away in 2019. So the grief and trauma around my dad's illness and death was really different. So I kind of have these two different experiences of grief and trauma. So that was the story with my dad. And there's a lot that we could get into with that. But then with Brian, my husband, he was diagnosed with melanoma when our daughter was 1.5. So that's a type of skin cancer. And this was in 2017 when he was first diagnosed. So he had a mole on his cheek that was starting to get itchy. And he went to the dermatologist, and the dermatologist biopsied it. And it turns out that it was a melanoma tumor that was really, really deep. And so that was terrifying at that time, because when a melanoma tumor is as deep as his was, it has often already spread to the organs, which means it's stage 4. And with stage 4 melanoma, it's very hard to treat. However, with his initial tumor, it hadn't spread at all. And so we went through, I think, what a lot of people with a cancer diagnosis go through, which is this sense that we're fine, that we got through this, we escaped the worst case scenario, and we thought he was totally in the clear, went on to live our lives relatively normally. And then a year and a half later, which was the very end of 2018, he started to feel sick and ended up finding out that he had melanoma. The melanoma had come back or been lying dormant, in his bloodstream for that whole time. And so what started as a flu quickly progressed into a lot of pain and a CT scan. And he was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma and passed away less than 7 weeks later. Wow. So a completely different type of experience with grief and trauma than my dad's, which was so slow and ongoing and very anticipatory. And with Brian, it was really scary diagnosis. You're totally fine. Really scary diagnosis. And then he passed away. So these two really extremely different life experiences that I've had with grief and trauma and loss. And then my dad passed away in 2021. So about 2 years after Brian.
Wow. Yes, I can tell from what you're saying about the speed in which you have to deal with a traumatic condition or diagnosis in your father's case, but then as well in Brian's case, makes a complete difference. Now, what interests me, you said it triggered the grief or the reaction that you had with your dad when Brian was diagnosed and when he died. Can you say a little bit more about that to make this a little bit more visually or sensory relatable for people listening?
Yeah. I mean, I think in life, when there starts to become what's perceived as a pattern, then that's when the trauma really, for me at least, I think that has impacted me a lot. So I'll just start with explaining kind of how that plays out for me, which is that now my subconscious, my body, my spirit has perceived this pattern where these men in my life who I have perceived as being either a protector or a partner or a teammate or, part of my inner circle are diagnosed with these horrible diseases that they end up leaving me either very quickly or slowly. And I think for a lot of us, and what I've learned a lot about kids' grief is that kids will often perceive these type of diagnoses or a death as an abandonment, even if that's not what it actually is. And so for me, when Brian passed away, there was this real sense of abandonment that I didn't understand because I'm like, I'm an adult. I fully grasp and understand that the last thing he wanted was to leave us. He wanted to stay so badly. And then there was at a certain point in my grief process, I realized it's because this is a pattern from childhood. And often with grief, I think these inner wounds or these inner childhood wounds are really brought to the surface because grief sort of exaggerates these things within us that might be lying dormant, or we might have, smoothed over in our life. And all of a sudden it's like all these feelings of, well, every time there's something that happens, it's going to be the worst case scenario and the person's going to die and leave. Like that's where my mind automatically would start to jump. And then I realized, well, yeah, because that's what happened to you when you were a kid. And then it happened again when you had just had a kid. So now this is this pattern. And I think for me, one of the ways that my trauma has really played out the most after Brian's death, and the part of my trauma that I have had the hardest time working through, has been this medical fear of something else horrible happening, or somebody else dying, or me dying, or this another horrible diagnosis, because now this has happened twice in my life, both times with people who were in a protective kind of a role in my life.
So like waiting for the next shoe to drop. Yeah. And also, I'm guessing I'm not very clear on what Parkinson looks like, or what it looked like in the case of your dad. But, abandonment, as we know in developmental or in relational trauma, is as well that slow disappearance. And it could even be from a healthy adult not being there, not being attuned to the child, not being adequately there for the child, is a sense of trauma. It's a chronic sense of trauma. And I don't know in your case with your dad and with his Parkinson, but it is, I'm assuming it is a kind of not having the dad the way you were used to him before. There's a change that happens with the diagnosis and the illness progressing that changes things irrevocably. How was that for you?
Yeah, I mean, it changed the dynamic within our whole family. And a lot of the focus really became around that. And it's taken me a really long time to even be able to acknowledge that, because as a little kid, I think I was very empathetic, and I took on a lot of that. And I remember feeling really sad for my dad growing up, and just really feeling like this was so unfair for him. And he was such a good dad, and he was so present, and he was so attuned to me and my sister. And so the way that I think it really played out for me, and this is to do with, my own little nervous system, my own soul path, whatever I was working on, was that I really did take on this like deep feeling of sadness for him and for my mom too, and like their loss. And that really impacted me a lot. And it developed into a lot of fear. I had a lot of fear about what's going to happen. What does the future hold? What does this look like? And that was how it really, I think, played out for me. And then was just re-triggered so much in Brian's diagnosis and death.
Do you feel like that having experienced that as a child has in some form robbed you from that innocence and belief that everything's going to turn out well, or that life is good?
I think it was really the double whammy of Brian also then being diagnosed, because I feel like I did have some of this medical anxiety and stuff going on before, but I think when I met him, I was like, oh, this is a new chance for us to create a family where it is going to work out. And he just had this sense to him that he felt like he was from a whole other universe to me. And I was like, this is this person who nothing bad will happen to him. Like I really did. But at the same time, I do remember, meeting him. And very early on in our relationship, I remember having this horrible nightmare that he died. One of like within the first months of us getting to know each other. So there was this fear in me of something happening to him, but I really didn't allow myself to really contemplate it. And I remember feeling like he was almost superhuman, like nothing bad would happen to him, and our family life was going to be different. And I think I did develop this sense of hope and trust in this recreation of this new family with him. And then it was that double whammy of it then happening to him, and then realizing that my daughter is now also in a different way being raised in this type of environment where she is aware well beyond her what, you know, we would hope kids, like she's aware earlier than what we wish our kids to be.
Yeah.
How do I say this? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, like the veil is lifting. She is aware that this type of thing can happen at a young age, just as I was. Like I remember being young and being like going to school, and none of my friends knew anything about having a parent with a chronic illness. None of my friends had to deal with any of that. And so then I feel this feeling of, oh my gosh, my daughter is also experiencing that in a different way, but also in a similar way. And that feels triggering to me too. But yeah, I think it really was with the second loss was really what pushed me over the edge into a lot more of the trauma around the medical stuff.
Yeah. You know, in my recent research about society, and originally I believed that we are a death avoiding society, and this sort of was contributed by the articles that I read. And I did a little bit more research on that. And actually, I found that they did some studies at the university in Israel where they found that there's inbuilt in the human brain is a capacity or a structure or skill, I don't know what you would call it, where the brain avoids death if it's related to ourselves. They showed pictures of images that were death related, like a funeral, and images of people crying. And whenever there was a picture of the person that they were doing the experiment with related to that, the brain was reacting as if this has nothing to do with me. So they found that it's like an inbuilt way for the person to protect themselves from the potential of death relating to the self. And so this avoidance, this is not an avoidance that is learned, but it's something that is inbuilt. And I was wondering whether us grievers or us being touched by significant loss, that the way you said it, like the veil has been lifted, the disillusion has been made. It's no longer an illusion, it's actually disillusion. And so because my daughter is 11 and a half, and she's been afraid of death or of us dying or of me dying or her dad dying since I can remember. So, and I mean, I remember as a child being afraid of death. But in her case, I mean, her veil has been lifted as part of growing up with a dead twin sister. I mean, this is a reality that we never shielded her from. It's just our family story. And then her grandmother, who died 4.5 months later from suicide. So she knows about these things. And it's not something that happens to other people. So I wonder, you know, like your daughter as well, when you say that her veil has been lifted early on, we grow up with the fact that life ends with death and not an avoidance of the natural order of things. But tell us a little bit, I mean, when Brian died, how did you deal with that loss? It was very sudden, given that you said it was 7 weeks after the second time he was diagnosed, or when it came back, or when it was discovered, to when he died. This is very quick. How did you deal with that time, and then when he died?
It was really, really quick. And Brian was such a strong, healthy, vibrant person that the transformation happening that quickly was so intense to see somebody just go from, I mean, he was running half marathons after dinner for fun, like a week before he got diagnosed, and then he was dead 7 weeks later. Like it was so quick. So when he was sick, we went into complete shock, and there was just adrenaline coursing through. And I was in a different zone. Like when I think back to that time, I was in a completely different zone of reality. It was like I was cushioned by so much shock, but I was also razor focused on him. And I remember knowing this time is so sacred. I had a really strong feeling he was going to die, which I know a lot of people go in the opposite direction where they're in denial about it until the very end. I remember even before he was diagnosed, maybe a few days before he was diagnosed, I remember walking with my sister in the park and I said, I think he's going to die. And of course she was like, oh my gosh, Mira, no, what are you talking about? We didn't even know what was going on with him at that point. And I remember saying, I think he's dying. It wasn't even, I think he's going to die. I was like, I can sense he's dying. There was a feeling that he was dying. And I was right. And then for those 7 weeks, though, the doctors were like, no, we can save him. And there's all these amazing treatments and blah, blah, blah. And so, we did all the things. We did what they wanted us to do. And I mean, that's what Brian wanted. And we did. And that kept us really busy because we were back and forth to the hospital all the time. And he was doing all sorts of treatments. And there was also this feeling of, this isn't working. Like in me, there was this feeling, this isn't working. And so, yes, we're going to do all of this, but also every single opportunity we have, I just want to connect with him. And I'm so focused on him. And it was like I had all this wisdom as well, where I knew there was this part of me that just knew what to do. And I tapped into this side of me that knew how to give somebody a death. And so finally, when the doctors were like, he's going to die, which they didn't actually say out loud until 6 days before he died, that was when I was just like, now it becomes all about giving him the death that I know he deserves. And so at that point, I just became so focused on this transformation that he was going through, this transition, and really just focused on giving him that death, that, giving him the best chance that I could at this transition into the next realm. And I really took that on as one of my major roles in this life. I was like, this is one of the most impactful things that I'm going to do. And when he did die, I mean, I was in so much pain. I was so sad. I was also in a lot of shock still. I'd say for the first year after his death, I was in a lot of shock. And it did numb the pain somewhat, but it was more like it numbed the reality. So I had this weird thing in my head where I was like, I just have to get through this year. This is a chapter in my life. This is a phase I have to get through. And that kind of kept me going. But I don't know even if it numbed the actual pain, because I remember being in so much pain and like allowing myself to feel that pain. And I couldn't really distract myself. I remember I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't read. I couldn't make small talk. It was like my whole focus was on him and the loss and my daughter and honoring him and writing about my grief and feeling my grief and listening to music. And it was all like, I really dove into it. That was just my process. And then the other major thing that happened that first year, well, there's two other major things. I became really antisocial. So that was kind of one of the main ways my grief manifested, was that I just knew so strongly in my gut that certain situations, people, experiences just were not, no, I could not do them. And after a lifetime of people pleasing and constantly putting my own needs second, I was like, I am going to do what I want to do. And I'm taking care of me and I'm taking care of my kid. And we are going to get through this the way that feels right for us. And that was really liberating too, because all of a sudden I was actually doing what I wanted to do for me. I started sharing my writing, which is how this whole Instagram thing happened, which I'd always been a writer and I'd always been far too scared to share any of my writing publicly, because I thought, who am I to share this? What are people going to think? All of that kind of creative stifling that I did to myself. So here I am in so much pain, but really coming into myself in this way that I never had before. And then the other thing that happened was that I became just obsessed with going on adventures. So I was like, let's go here. And this was the year before COVID. We had 1 year before COVID. And because this was 2019, March of 2019, that Brian died. So we were just going on all sorts of adventures. We were all over the place. It was such a wild time. So that was kind of how those initial early days and the death itself kind of manifested for me.
So you mentioned your writing, and you mentioned traveling, and you mentioned social seclusion. I mean, traveling, you sort of meet people, but they're not as close as you can choose who you want to talk about it and in how much detail. But what did these things do for you that helped you in your grief? If you're reflecting back now, it's 4 years later, and you're looking at those resources that you drew from, what do you think they did for you in your journey after grief, in your healing journey?
When we traveled, we didn't really socialize with people. So the traveling was very much about my daughter and I on an adventure, connecting. You know, we'd go places where it wasn't like we were meeting tons of people and being social. It was like we were in our little bubble, but we were going on these adventures to different places. And I think a big part of that for me was because I couldn't find any distractions, but that was kind of the only thing that worked, was the novelty of just literally ripping us out of our home and going to a completely new place. And I remember just, you know, I'd take her out, we'd go, you know, to the beach, or we'd go out for dinner or something. And I'd be like, nobody here knows our story. Nobody's looking at me with pity. Nobody's expecting anything of me. They probably just think I'm a single mother by choice, or who knows what they think. And I had no desire to be like in the spotlight. And I felt like when we were at home, it's like, I felt everybody was like, how's she gonna get through this? What's she gonna do? Oh my God, poor her, poor her, poor her. And I couldn't stand like the look in people's eyes of like, either a deer in headlight, like so awkward around me all the time, or that pity, like those types of things. It's just like, I had so much I was carrying already. I couldn't carry all of that on top of my own stuff. And I also felt, I think the travel for me and the antisocial, both of those things, I think were a product of, I felt like I wanted to figure this out for myself. And I really feel like this grief and this loss pushed me into this journey of inner exploration, where I was like, I don't want to do what everybody thinks that I should do or expects of me. I know that the way that I'm going to get through this is by listening to myself. And I'd always struggled with that. I'd always struggled with really doing what I wanted to do and not thinking of everyone else's needs. And this was the first time in my life when I was like, no, this is about me. And I deserve, it's like I finally gave myself permission to be selfish. And I don't even know if selfish is the right word, but that's the judgment kind of word that I put on myself because I thought that was wrong.
I say selfish is the word that people pleaser use when they start to think about themselves and self-care.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. Totally. And I was like, I deserve to be selfish. Look at what I've been through, you know? And it was life-changing for me. And it's like I couldn't do that surrounded by all these people that knew us. I had to get away, get into new environments to really connect to myself. I've always been really impacted by my environment. I'm very sensitive. I was always really impacted by the people I was around, the energies I was around. I'm still like that. But I think in grief, it became even more important. And I for once felt like I deserved it.
And then what I'm dying to ask, that's a really stupid thing to say in a podcast about grief and trauma. But what I'm really interested to find out is, but somewhere along the road, you really came into, or from your writing, you came into understanding so much about grief and trauma and about the nervous system. So how did that come into your life, or how did you find that part?
In terms of understanding grief and trauma, I think, and then there's the nervous system stuff, which came later for me. So when my loss first happened, I became obsessed with understanding the grieving process. That was what happened.
Me too.
Yeah. I feel like there's a certain kind of personality where there's something that just clicks and it's like, I need to understand this. So like, this is a really good example of this. I couldn't read anything for about 3 years, except if it had to do with grief. I could read until the cows came home. I could read and read and read and read and read. And it's like my brain only had the capacity to understand grief stuff and nothing else. I couldn't focus on anything else. But I became, and even reading that was hard at the beginning, but I would listen to audiobooks, I'd listen to podcasts. And then I really just started exploring it within myself more than anything. So I remember I would just have these, even as Brian was dying, I'd have these realizations about life. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to write this down. I have to write this down immediately. And it was like this obsessive thing where as he was dying, I was having all of these insights about life were just coming in like almost from the heavens. Like it was just like these really beautiful realizations about life. And I was like, I need to, so like at his deathbed, I was writing obsessively. And then after he died, it's like all these things about life and grief and death and everything was just rolling in and all of this insight. And I was writing it all down and then exploring what that meant and then reading what other people were writing about grief and then reflecting it back to myself. And it just became this real obsession of understanding this whole process. So that was kind of how it started for me. And then I started sharing my writing and then people started reaching out to me and commenting on what I was sharing. And then it became this whole thing of understanding all of our different processes and how they all are different and similar. And it just became such an interest of mine. And then with the nervous system aspect, I was completely unable to do any nervous system or somatic work for the first few years. So about a year before Brian died, I took up Qigong, and that was kind of really my first foot into the realm of nervous system work. And I immediately fell in love with Qigong. I started going every single week. It changed my life. And as Brian was dying, I did a lot of Qigong like around the room while he was dying. I was just, doing different stuff in the space where he was passing away. And I was doing different qi brushing, which is an exercise where you can kind of like move qi or energy through people. And I was doing a lot of that on him and he was loving it. So like as his soul was leaving, I was doing so much of this work with him. But then as soon as he died, it was like the pain was so intense that I literally couldn't even tap into that world for years. And I was just so focused on the cognitive piece and the emotions and understanding, and then also like allowing my emotions to flow, which had been really hard for me prior in life. So emotions had been something that I really uncovered with Brian. He was probably the first person in my life I felt really safe to express my emotions with. And in relationship with him, I discovered I was a very emotional person and I actually have really big emotions that I had just been too scared to share my whole life. So the first few years of my grieving process was this cognitive, this understanding the process, finally the sharing of emotions. Like I remember the first time I worked through a few therapists before I actually even found a therapist who I was able to cry with. Like it took me, I remember going to a therapist like 6 weeks after he died and I was just like completely blank. Like I couldn't even cry. So that was the first piece. And then there was and I couldn't do Qigong. So after doing Qigong every day for a year, I just completely stopped. I couldn't do it. And then it wasn't honestly really until like a year ago, like this exact time last year. So this would be 3 years after his death, where I really had this realization, like it's time for me to start processing and feeling into some of this grief that's in my body. And for me, nervous system work began with returning to Qigong. And that was because it was something familiar to me. And I started attending my weekly classes again, now online. And that was kind of my first step into the nervous system work. And then this past year for me has really been about allowing myself to finally do some of this nervous system work of the trauma and grief in my body. But I had to work through those other layers first. And that was just my journey into it.
You know, when I think about the nervous system, which I just teach as well in my class, it is that when I look at it, I say, for example, people who can't get up in the morning after they had a significant loss, they're what I call it freeze. They are in a state of parasympathetic shutdown. They may be stuck on off, so they can't regulate down, but they're frozen in that space. Whereas people who are hyper alert and always looking for the next shoe to drop or active, they are stuck on. They're in the activation, in the fight and flight, and they're sort of always hovering in that place. However, the homeostasis, or the best way for the nervous system to be regulated, and I'm speaking your language, is to be going through all the levels of the house, of the nervous system. Would you say that is, I mean, I see you're nodding. For the people listening, they can't see that, and smiling. You know, and that's a good thing for people to understand. And now that you have this understanding, I feel that a lot of people who come to me, they are either dealing with the grief or the trauma on one or the other level, but not really integrating bottom up and top down regulatory stuff. You know, like meditation or relaxation can be good if someone is not moving, but if someone is moving all the time, there's the other side that needs to come up. Or if someone is on the top of the system where they are stuck, they need to first come in activation to then be able to go into a restful space. Now, how did you, I mean, I know from your sharing, and today you just shared something about the dysregulated nervous system. What would you say to someone at the beginning of their journey? What would you want them to know, given what you have discovered in the last 4 years? What would be something that you would want to impart on other people listening to this?
I mean, in terms of in general, and well, I guess these are my answers for both are related, but I feel like the most important thing in this whole grief process and in relation to the nervous system is to really focus on yourself and what you need, because there's so, exactly like you were just saying, everybody has a different home that they return to in their nervous system when they go through trauma. So some of us have this hyper aroused state. So we tend to find our home in a more unregulated state where everything's on high alert. That's very much me. And so those would be the people that we see who tend to have more anxiety. They tend to be more go, go, go. They might be overachievers. Like even with me, the way that I see how I turn to writing and sharing and creating and all of these things, like, yes, those things were good, but also I had a really hard time turning that off. And I got a lot of positive reinforcement for that. And that helped me, but I was really go, go, go a lot and really trying to, I kind of turned a lot of my anxiety into, well, I'll share and it'll help someone and that'll make me feel better. And it was this like release of feeling good about myself in that way. And then we have, so I think people kind of tend to find a home in either the hyper or the hypo. So the hype, and some people just go back and forth and yo-yo back and forth, right? But then the hypo aroused being more like, yeah, you said not being able to get out of bed, the shutdown, more depression, more like what, there's no meaning to life. There's no point to life. Why would I even get up? What would I do? What's the point? Like all of that. And so I find that I think one of the most important things that we can do after a loss is really just turn to ourselves and start to learn to listen to what we need. What is my grief process asking of me? What can I do for myself to get myself through this? What resources can I tap into? Not what other people think, not what other people expect of me, not what other people want, but what do I actually need? And that's sort of going inward and learning to listen to ourselves. And then I think that relates to the nervous system as well, because for me, at least, one of the first steps of getting back in tune with my body and my nervous system was actually just even figuring out what my body was telling me, because I was completely blocking it out and I wasn't really listening to what my body was saying. And I think that had been a pattern probably from earlier in life. And I had always kind of done that. And then that went into overdrive after Brian died. And I was just go, go, go all the time and not really stopping, because to actually stop and pause and actually feel what your body is telling you can be so scary and so vulnerable. And I think, I was talking with another grief coach about this the other day, and she was we were talking about this early grief and what type of somatic work is helpful in early grief, because a lot of the time it can be really hard to practice somatic work early, because either, like for me, stopping and slowing down in any way and trying to do meditation or trying to do yoga, it was like the anxiety and the thoughts became so loud and so scary. And I couldn't do it. Like I had to do these other things first, like all this writing and this traveling and other things. And eventually I got there, and now I can meditate and I can be still, but it didn't feel like I was ready early on. And then I know for some people early on, if they try to do really intense exercise and their heart rate starts going, then that can throw them into anxiety, because then their body's like, oh, I remember the last time you felt this way. You were in this situation where your husband was dying. And so it's going to trigger that, right? So I think the most important step is just really listening to what feels right for you and being in tune and remembering that there's time. Like it doesn't all need to happen immediately. And maybe for some people, for the first year, it is all just distraction and traveling and little pockets here and there where they're really processing in moments that they can. But it's just, we're all so different. And there's so much pressure that we put on ourselves to do it right, or to get to a certain place in our grief, or to heal within a certain timeline. And it's just so unique for everybody. So I think that would be my main piece of advice.
And you sharing about this, and we're just starting to open the Pandora's box, that I feel that we just really have a common language here. And maybe there is a chance for us to do a part 2 where we actually really just take that topic. And, I shared with you, Mira, at the beginning, I sort of keep the podcasts around 40, 45, 50 minutes at the most for people to get used to it. But for now, I just want to thank you for sharing this, and I'm so interested to hear more. But for now, would it be okay to bring this to a round end and keep some more for another time?
Of course.
So, as you know, I'm finishing the podcast with rapid fire questions, and it's just finishing a sentence starter for people to hear what different people dealing with grief and trauma has to say about that. So the first one is, grieving and trauma means?
Meeting yourself.
And healing means?
Something different for everybody.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
That I'm capable of so much more than I would have thought.
And I think we discussed quite a bit, but if there was one thing that you wish people would know about loss and trauma, what would that be?
That it's not low vibe, it's not bad, it's not negative. It's one of the most beautiful and real parts of being human.
And one specific thing that has changed since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss?
I've rediscovered my creative self. I was creatively stifled before my loss. And then when Brian died, it was like all of a sudden, I could not care less what anyone thought of me. And I gave myself permission for the first time to find my creative voice. And probably the expression of my creativity has been the greatest gift of this loss.
And I can definitely attest to that, because what you have written and what you share, I mean, nowadays a writer can be an Instagram writer or a person expressing their creativity through that. And this is what has drawn me to you. So thank you so much for giving us a window into into yourself, into a little bit more about Mira. Thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.